We're talking about perfusion. And as we talk about perfusion, we need to discuss the opening and closing of capillary beds in different areas. And to the end of understanding how your body controls perfusion, we have been discussing three circulatory routes. We started with this one, skeletal muscle. And in this one, we learned that when you are just sitting there, not doing much at all, there is very little blood going through each gram of leg muscle tissue per minute. But if you are exercising super hard, these mechanisms could increase the perfusion to your skeletal muscle by about 20-fold. So there could be 20 times as much blood running through the tissue of your skeletal muscle if you're exercising. And we're comparing that to two other circulatory routes. Each one of the other two circulatory routes is in some ways the opposite of what skeletal muscle does. Let's start with talking about the brain. At the end of the last video, I told you that the brain actually does not change its amount of perfusion on a moment-by-moment basis the way skeletal muscle does. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I like to think of the brain as it likes what it likes, and that's what it likes. So it doesn't see any need to be changing things around. One thing that is certainly true about the brain is that even seconds of closing down capillary beds inside different parts of the brain would cause an immediate loss of consciousness. That means that your skeletal muscle is willing to be taken offline periodically, but not parts of your brain. But why don't we see a dramatic upregulation either? Well, your brain has got these very specific blood-brain barrier insulated capillary beds, and because of that, there's not room for a dramatic upregulation as well. I wanted to make one little point about circulation through the brain. There is a condition that will cause the brain to decrease perfusion, to shut down relatively some of its capillary beds. And that condition is when the body has become too alkaline. When a person is hyperventilating, we will learn that when you are hyperventilating, you actually get rid of too much carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a waste product, but that doesn't mean that we want it all gone. The carbon dioxide that's in your bloodstream is acting as a buffer. But if a person hyperventilates, they will actually get rid of too much carbon dioxide, and that will make your blood too alkaline. Normally, carbon dioxide will mix with water to make this thing carbonic acid. If you don't have enough CO2, then you don't have enough acid, and not enough acid will be too alkaline. If there's not enough CO2 because of hyperventilation, then it'll actually cause vasoconstriction in your brain, and that causes a loss of consciousness. So I want to remind you that when it comes to ventilating a patient, breathing for them, it is definitely possible to do it too frequently. If while you are breathing for a patient, you're bagging the patient by hand, if you're doing it too quickly, you are harming the patient as much as if you weren't doing it at all. So one of the reasons is because of the brain's response to not enough CO2 to an alkaline condition in the body. Now, let's talk about lungs. Lungs are particularly relevant right now in the time of this COVID-19 pandemic. There is generally low blood pressure in the lungs, and there's a good reason for that. The system of the watery part of the blood leaving at the beginning of a capillary bed and jumping back on board at the end of a capillary bed, that's great everywhere else in the body, but it would not be good in the lungs. So in the lungs, blood pressure at the beginning of capillary beds is so low that almost no watery stuff leaves those capillary beds. And the reason is that if watery stuff left the capillary beds in your lungs, that watery stuff would go into your alveoli. Those air sacs, they're designed to hold air, not water. So we don't want that same mechanism of water leaving at the beginning of a capillary bed and jumping on board, back on board at the end, not in the lungs. And that is why it is important for the pulmonary system to have lower blood pressure. Also, lower blood pressure allows the blood to flow more slowly and gives it more time for gas exchange. One of the things that can happen in patients that have this COVID-19 infection is some of those patients, the blood pressure inside of their lungs increases and causes a little bit of water to go into their air sacs, their alveoli, and causes them to drown. That is one of the problems we're seeing, and it is related to the physiology that we're discussing now. Here's something that is particularly important for this COVID-19 pandemic. The lungs have got a very unique response to hypoxia. It's very important that you know this for our exam. The arteries, little arteries and arterioles that supply blood to the muscle tissue, when the environment becomes low oxygen or acidic, that smooth muscle relaxes and allows more blood to flow through. The lungs, it's backwards. If there is an area of the lungs that is not getting enough oxygen, that area will be deprived of blood. That's backwards of the muscle tissue, right? In the muscle tissue, if there's an area that's running out of oxygen, more blood goes there. In the lungs, if there's an area running out of oxygen, less blood goes there. Now, there's a word for this, and it is not called that. Let me type it out for you. The name for this effect is ventilation-perfusion coupling. Ventilation-perfusion coupling. Do you remember a while ago I told you that I wanted you to memorize the Frank Starling law of the heart, because someday when you're actually in clinics, it's going to make you look smart, all right? I want you to memorize this one too, ventilation-perfusion coupling. Believe me, you're going to hear it a lot. Ventilation-perfusion coupling is actually a very descriptive term, so you don't really have to memorize it. You just have to think about what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is the more ventilation a part of the lung gets, ventilation, air going in and out, the more air going in and out to a little chunk of lung tissue, the more blood will go to that chunk of lung tissue. If there's an area of the lung where air is not going in and out, then blood will not go to that chunk of lung tissue. Ventilation-perfusion coupling. The more air going in and out, the more blood goes in. The coupling of ventilation and perfusion. Why am I enforcing that so much? Whenever you've got a patient that is bedbound for any reason, then the parts of their lungs that are on the bottom side of their body will begin to get less ventilation. And that will cause those areas to get less blood going to those areas. Think about what's going to happen then. If there's a chunk of lung tissue, maybe it's this little bit right here, and there's no air going in and out to that part of the lung, that means less blood will go there as well. If less blood goes there, then any bacteria that have been lucky enough to get to that part of lung tissue, there will not be white blood cells going there to fight off and kill the bacteria that have landed there. That's a little chunk of your patient's lung that is very likely to allow a pneumonia, a bacterial pneumonia, to set up. There is also a link to this COVID-19. One of the things that's happening in patients with COVID-19 is that the parts of their alveoli are filling with fluid. When those chunks of lung tissue fill up with fluid, there is no ventilation to that part of the lung. So there will be no blood going to that part of the lung. And that starts a cascade of adverse effects in the lungs. One of the reasons why we put patients on ventilators is to force ventilation into all of those parts of the lungs so that there will be blood going to all of those parts of the lungs, because only if blood is going to an area of the lung is there a chance for your immune system to fight off the viral infection that's going on in that chunk of lung tissue. So ventilation perfusion coupling is relevant to this COVID-19 pandemic, but it also is relevant just day to day. Please remember, someday after this is all over, when you're just taking care of regular patients in their hospital beds, they need to cooperate wholeheartedly with the respiratory therapists that are helping them. Patients that are really sick in a hospital bed, they just want to lie there and sleep, right? You can't blame them. But if they just lie on their side and sleep, they will end up getting a bacterial pneumonia, and they'll be in the hospital a lot longer. If you encourage them to sit up and to fully cooperate with their respiratory therapist who's making them breathe deeply and cough and blow into these different devices, they are less likely to get pneumonia, and they're going to end up going home earlier. So please encourage your patients to cooperate really wholeheartedly with what the respiratory therapist is asking of them. Why? Ventilation perfusion coupling. Oh, the blood-brain barrier is still there. All right, that's it for this video. We will pick up talking about blood pressure in our next video.